Whoever the John was that wrote that lesson, 1 John, about loving one another, obviously didn't have brothers and sisters and never worked in an office. Loving people is a hard thing to do. This morning, when I came in for the 8 o'clock service, I was lamenting that when I was in Kingman and I did Anthony and Medicine Lodge, I would get to drive. I'd say I would get to drive. Joyce would get to drive me to Anthony or Medicine Lodge, and I would be able to listen to the Lutheran hour or a Baptist sermon, and if it was better than what I had prepared, I'd use it. But it was just a 2-block drive down here, so I only caught a little bit of a commercial. It was a commercial about some kind of health program that a Christian can sign up for. And it was a good program for Christians because it didn't cover any of those sinful things. It didn't elaborate on what they were, but I thought it was really helpful that somebody out there is helping me understand what's sinful. You know, we have guidelines. This dawned on me. You know, I've read this lesson. I heard it this morning, and I heard it again this time when we've got this guy, the eunuch, who runs. You know, Philip's explaining what this lesson means, and then the eunuch says, "Look, there's water. What is to prevent me from being baptized?" And I thought to myself, have you been to the pre-baptism classes? Are your parents communicants of the church? You know, we always find ways to put doors that have to go through to be what some would consider to be Christian. And we make those doors sometimes very difficult to open. But the gospel says, and that lesson says, we've got to love. Several years ago, a long time ago, the first church I served as an assistant back in 1972. Bring me a chair. I need to sit down. Back in 1972, I worked with a wonderful priest, David Evans. He was the rector of the church. I was the assistant. And here's how nice this guy was. When I showed up at that church as the assistant, the sign out in front of the church said, the Reverend David H. Evans, rector. When they put my name on the sign, he dropped the term rector. He says, you know who the rector is. The congregation knows who the rector is. The people in this community just have to know there's 2 clergy here. That's a classy guy. Well, we really were an interesting congregation. And, you know, I worked in starting a free health clinic in the community. But David had another mission. Back in those days, back in 1972, a woman's right to terminate a pregnancy was illegal in Michigan. It was illegal in a lot of places, but specifically in Michigan. And there were a group of clergy across the state of Michigan, and they were interdenominational. There were Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Methodists, Lutherans, the good kind. There weren't any Roman Catholics, and there weren't many Baptists. But what these clergy did was they met with women and girls who found themselves pregnant, and they would counsel them. And if they felt that this was the thing, that they really understood the consequences, they would refer them to a clinic in Chicago where they could get this situation resolved. Now, there were a group of people in town, Roman Catholics and Baptists, who used to picket the front of this church, which coincidentally was Grace Episcopal Church. And I was proud to be a minister at a church that was having picketers. I mean, they'd be marching up in front, up and back and chanting, you know. And I said to David, I said, can I do something to upset them so they can be here more frequently? And he said, no, the vestry's already upset with what we're getting now. So anyway, they would be there regularly. Well, one day, David came into my office. His face was red. I could tell he was upset about something. And I said, David, what's wrong? And he said, I've just got to come down here and blow off some steam. He said, I got a woman in my office. The woman who leads the picket and protest in front of the church. She's there with her high school daughter, who happens to be pregnant. He said, I asked the daughter to leave my office, and I said to this woman, don't you picket the front of this church a couple times a month? And she said, yes. He said, but you're here wanting me to refer you to a clinic in Chicago so your daughter can terminate her pregnancy. And she said, yes. She's not like all those other loose girls at the high school. So David and I talked, had a cup of coffee. He went back down. He referred her and the daughter to the clinic in Chicago. 2 weeks later, she was leading the picket in front of the church. Because, see, there are some people who know how you need to love your brother and sister. It's difficult for us to love everybody. I don't do it. You know, when I watch on the news and I see people with knives at the throat of Christians cutting off their heads, I find it very difficult to love those people. Well, it's not difficult. I don't love them. But yet that lesson says we need to love one another. How can I possibly reconcile that? Well, Jesus, in the gospel, this is a sort of an interlude between this dialogue that he's having with his disciples before he is crucified. This interlude with the allegory of the vine, and God is the gardener, and Jesus is the vine, and the disciples are the branches. He says to them, you don't bear fruit unless you're part of the vine. And if you're not bearing fruit, the gardener is liable to clip off those branches and put them on the compost pile. And I think to myself, ooh, I guess I'm heading for compost. Because I don't love everybody. I try hard, but I just can't love everybody. But I don't have a list of rules what it takes to love somebody. But I take solace in this one important thing. Jesus is talking to his disciples. These branches that are grafted to his vine. And who are they? Well, there's Judas. There's Peter. There's Thomas. At some point in their lives, they didn't bear fruit. But you know, a good gardener can graft a branch back to the vine. And that's the hope I have as a Christian. That when I fall short, when I miss the mark, when I find myself just unable to love everyone, I know that somehow God will try to get me back on the vine. It is not an easy thing. But we need to spend more time trying to find out how to get reattached to the vine than some of us spend finding ways to prune branches from the vine. We are not the gardener. God is the gardener. God will prune those branches. We don't have to do it. What we have to do is struggle with our own sinful nature and try with all our might to love everyone. Now, that's an easy thing to say, but it's a hard thing to do. I worked in an office. I know there are people out there who make themselves very difficult to love. I've taught school. Anybody ever teach school, you know. It's hard to love them all. I got a couple in one of my classes right now I'm not very happy with. I'm ready to prune them myself. But I got to struggle with that. And the important thing is realizing that we're struggling with it. We're not perfect. No matter who that woman was selling health insurance, trying to exclude people, she's not perfect, although she thinks she is. Like that woman who led the protests in front of the church office, she's not perfect, although she thinks she is. What we have as Christians is the realization that we're not perfect. We still are asked to love one another, but we're forgiven when we fall short. So join me in the challenge. Realizing that no matter how difficult it is, God will still graft us to the vine as long as we struggle with trying to love everyone regardless of their race, their color, their creed, their religion, or who they love. We are called upon to love, not to judge.